Good afternoon. Welcome to Robots and Red Tape. I'm your host, Nick Shutt. Lucky to have my good friend, Mr. Brian Sacash, on with us today. Brian, how you doing, man?
I'm good, Nick. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, man. I appreciate you making the time. I know you're very, very busy. But Brian, if you don't mind, would you just tell myself and the listeners a little bit about yourself, your background, and kind of why you're here?
Yeah. So I am currently the director of data science at a company called Red Horse. We focus on doing a lot of advanced analytics for different federal customers. Um, and so, in terms of my background, I've always been in the data field. Got my undergrad in physics. So I had a lot of that math background, really didn't know where to push that, but eventually through grad school, got into the world of data mining, simulation, modeling, things like that, which kind of naturally led me to the data science field, where I've been, with large companies, I've been with small companies, really focused on this. But the key thread there has always been deriving insights from data, and even more specifically around unstructured data.
Fantastic, man. I appreciate it. And I know you have a deep background and have a deep interest in natural language processing and
Mhm.
NLP. How did you get to, interested in language first, and then second, what are you really interested in now, and kind of what are you curious about now?
Yeah, so it was kind of funny how it all happened, where, because I mentioned with my background, there was a lot of, numeric computation,
Hmm.
deriving equations, doing a lot of things like probability and statistics. And I just never came across, uh, in my, educational career, anyone doing anything with text, actually, until the very end. I think I was in one grad class and someone did a project. That was kind of related.
Hmm.
And I thought, okay, well, that's interesting. I've never seen that done before. And it wasn't until early in my career that there was a question posed around this. And then I started digging into it and found out that, yes, you can, do a lot of this type of computational processing on unstructured text.
Hmm.
And I thought it was the most fascinating thing I'd ever seen. I remember, in those early days, I went and built a probabilistic kind of basic chatbot, and it was super dumb. It was super
Hmm.
dumb. I think I trained it off of like some classic American novels, and it would just try to assemble phrases together. And again,
Hmm.
as sensical as it was, I was just like, this is cool.
Yeah.
I want to do more with this.
Hmm.
And so throughout my career, I've always tried to find those problems that kind of lend themselves to um, those types of algorithms that we deal with that. And so, as you can imagine, getting to where we are now, I would say probably, with everything we've been seeing with ChatGPT and OpenAI, um, that has really taken off, and not only just taken off, but actually kind of really changed direction, because a lot of what we've seen and what we've done with natural language processing for the longest time has just kind of been rewritten. The thing I like to joke about is I've got one of these books on statistical approaches to natural language processing,
Hmm.
and well, yes, it's kind of one of those fundamental texts. I don't know if anyone would need to kind of go through that type of literature anymore, because the game has changed so much.
Hmm. Hmm. How has it changed? And how is, I mean, you mentioned things reversing course. How are things reverse course?
Yeah, so I mean, the way that we've seen things change in terms of like the way that models have been used, and so that's really come about through the deep learning movement.
Hmm.
And I think it's a function of a few different things that kind of have aligned. The first one being access to data, and I
Hmm.
think we have the internet to thank for that. Where for the longest time it was carefully collected and curated information. So if you go back to some of the classic data collections, you'll see, either books. There's the Gutenberg project, which has a lot of classic books in it that are kind of more in the open domain that you can use. There are a lot from past news articles. You think of things like the Enron emails, things like that that have been released for people to use. And for a while, that was a lot of what you could use with data in this space. But then with the internet, all of a sudden you could build a scraper and just start running through stuff
Hmm.
and collecting a lot more data. Whether you're supposed to or not, people are doing it.
Right.
And all of a sudden you have so much more data, and then you pair that with computation. So it's really what we're seeing with all the everything going on with NVIDIA right now, and having more and more powerful chips. Um, Again, kind of looking backwards, we didn't we had graph GPUs. Um, they weren't really being tailored for this type of learning, and once we did and started unleashing that, all of a sudden these older algorithms that had theoretically been around and we've had in small examples, we could have started applying at scale. And so
Hmm.
by all those things coming together, we kind of it's almost like we found this extra room in our house that we didn't know was there. And we're like, okay, now we can start doing all this new stuff.
Hmm.
And I think because of that, everything that we had been doing were these minor step changes. And then kind of when we opened up this new space, we said, okay, we can start thinking about how to do things differently.
That's very cool. That's fantastic, man. I appreciate that. And so, yeah, I know in some of our conversations that we've had, you mentioned that you are big into privacy. That's a
Mm-hmm.
big thing for you personally. And so, kind of what are as we think about AI and these, first people feet, I think, if you have a social media presence or you have written a blog or something, to your point about scrapers, I would assume that all of that data is in all of these in all these models from a base, and in their training data. But in addition to that, all the information that people are voluntarily putting in about
Mm-hmm.
themselves, about anything else, and how they talk and how they interact. And I would assume you could, potentially, extrapolate how somebody thinks based on all the information they put in, and kind of build a profile on them. I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination, but what are some of the biggest privacy concerns facing, the AI industry at large right now?
Yeah, and I mean, I think privacy is a big issue because I'm kind of one of those people that have seen it kind of become a luxury.
Hmm.
Think about privacy a lot of the times. Again, I like to look backwards and try to see how the trends have gone. And
Hmm.
for the longest time, right, your email was provided by your internet service provider, and then all of a sudden we started seeing you saw the rise of things like Hotmail and AOL, and we got to Yahoo email and things like Gmail. And as you progressed, those things all of a sudden, instead of saying I have to have an internet service provider I pay for to get my email, all of a sudden you can have free email. But again, that comes at the cost of a bit of privacy, and that can be okay, right? If you're okay with that, that's fine. That's just another form of, and you can say payment. A lot of times you can think about, all right, Gmail is huge, but the way that that is funded is um, they can serve you ads, or there was, I believe for a while where there might have been some type of model training on that data. And if you're fine with that, that's okay. That's a good equitable trade if you want. But for some people, they're not as comfortable with that because they did kind of subscribe to that earlier notion of, well, this is my mail, my communication, my inbox.
Hmm.
Um, and so I kind of see that in the same way with AI, where we're kind of entering this new realm. We have these new tools now that we didn't
Hmm.
have a few years back, and I think privacy is not at the forefront of that, which I think makes sense, right? This is really exciting technology, and we're kind of shooting out the gates here, and we're very excited and moving as fast as we can. And then I think as maybe some of that dust settles, we start to think about some of these other things. And I think privacy is going to be one of them.
Hmm.
And I think you kind of hit on it a little bit around, yes, there's the one side of, all right, if I write a blog post, that might be scraped. And, maybe I have some reasonable expectation that that would happen. I mean, I'm putting it online.
Hmm.
People are going to see it. People are going to do stuff with it. Not much I can do about that. But on the other side, you have the data that you're feeding models.
Hmm.
And I think what we've seen in the news around this are potentially companies that are using things like ChatGPT with proprietary corporate information. And this can be as simple as saying, "Hey, I'm trying to reword this email to my boss. Can you help me?" And it depends what you're saying in there. To maybe some type of quarterly report
Hmm.
with confidential figures in there. And we can think about this in terms of, okay, well, it's just me and my account sending that to a particular model, but we really have to start to understand what's happening on the back end. And the way that I think about it is for a long time when I've worked with these types of models, conversational data was really, really hard to find.
Mhm,
I remember, I think it was around the era of when GPT-2 was out. Um, and for anyone who hasn't used that, that was before it was conversational. That's when you would have a model, you could start typing and it would kind of finish writing for you. You couldn't
mm,
really instruct it too well. And around that time, there were people talking about, well, could these things be conversational?
mhm,
And I remember kind of saying, okay, that's an interesting question. And if you start looking out for training data, again, we think about what I was talking about earlier around how you can look back and say, well, what data used to be available?
mhm,
There really wasn't conversational data because when you think about it, and when I say conversational data, I mean two-person, two-sided conversational data.
mhm,
And so, where's all that data? It's usually in chat logs and text messages. And those are things that people don't really want to give up for other people to play around and train models
mm-mm.
on, right?
Nope.
I, yeah, I can't imagine too many people where you're like, can I borrow your phone? I just want to download all your text messages to train a model. I think most people would be like, yeah, no thanks. No thanks.
Mhm.
And
Exactly.
so when you really think about it, there's a pretty big price in terms of who can get that type of data. And we started seeing that with OpenAI, where um, they kind of took the long route and said, all right, we're going to get a bunch of people to sit down and we're going to start making question answer pairs, right? If I ask this question, what would a human respond? And eventually, if you get enough of those and feed those to a model, it's going to start replicating that pattern.
Mhm,
But now that the ball has started rolling and we have momentum, and now that we're interacting with these systems, if you're using this every day, you're creating two-sided conversational data every day. And for the companies that are hosting these models and that are sitting on these platforms, it's just falling into their hands, which then they can turn around and make even better models.
mhm,
And again, that could be a good thing if uh, if you're thinking about how it's being done and you're just asking questions, maybe the way you would query a search engine, that could be perfectly fine. But it's those edge cases where if you're uploading information that could be proprietary or private, and you're not really up on the privacy practices or how those companies are using those models, those could get baked back in.
mhm,
Um, and we could say, all right, well, it's getting lost in the sea of data, but we have seen reports where some of these models can perfectly replicate some of their training data. And there
mhm.
is a non-zero chance that some of that information could come out for somebody else that's using the model at some day.
It's fascinating. No, that's absolutely fascinating. And how do you think a lot of this, kind of impacts individual privacy? But also, in addition to that, how can we as individuals, protect ourselves while at the same time, not like cutting off our nose to spite our face and just like not using these tools to begin with?
Yeah, so I do think not using the tools is not really a good answer.
Hmm.
And I think it goes back to what we're saying is kind of be cautious of what you're sharing. I always kind of imagine the idea of, right, if you're working with one of these chat-based AI systems, kind of assume it's just not you by yourself. It's not just you and some model. It's you, the model, and the company behind it, and everyone that runs that. So you can
Hmm.
kind of almost imagine that, if you're working with take your pick of your favorite one that you use. Imagine that company is also in the room with you.
Hmm.
Um, so it kind of leads you to think about who's supporting them. And I think we're starting to see a lot of new companies come about that, their aims are kind of different. Some are more focused on just general models, some are more focused on coding based models. So I like to think about, who's supporting these and what's their aim and what's their goal. And a lot of times it makes a lot of sense, right? They're a business, they're trying to provide a service. So if there's some way that they can make their service better by using that data, that could be good. But
Hmm.
again, back into that privacy issue of we've seen it with intellectual property around coding repositories. So some of these models that are really good at coding, again, you can go through something like GitHub and scrape a bunch of these repositories. And again, you could say, all right, well, by assuming that it's online, that someone might use it. But a lot of these things have different, different statuses on how you can use them.
Hmm.
And it's likely that uh, some of those are being broken and shouldn't be used for these models.
Mhm.
But again, it gets to the point where people are saying, yeah, there have been reports of people that have seen their proprietary code be spat out. Now, again, there's the only way that we can only take that on empirical evidence of someone saying, hey, I wrote this code, here's a picture of it, it's proprietary, and it spat out the same thing. And we can say,
Mhm.
okay, maybe.
Right.
But it's something to definitely think about.
Mhm.
So in terms of how to protect it, I think the best answer, well, I think the easiest answer, but not necessarily the best answer, is just try to use things that are open source. But I
Mhm.
realize that's not something that everyone can do. But I know there are a lot of people out there that are saying, okay, a lot of these models have been open sourced. If you have the know-how, you can pull this down. And if you're someone who's like, hey, I'm just trying to rewrite emails or spell check things
Mhm.
or help writing with drafts, those models can be good.
Mhm.
Not powerful, but they can get the job done. But I think maybe the easier one is using more privacy respecting services. And so there are some that are out there that are, I think, starting to recognize this trend and this pattern and had said, hey, you know what? We're going to take some of these, the better open source models, and host them,
Mhm.
and let people use them. And if you go through their terms of service and privacy agreements, they have said, you know, we're not going to keep any logs.
Mhm.
Everything you say is isolated. Again, you have to take them at their word for that.
Yeah.
So it all comes down to what you believe. Um, but also, you just really got to make sure that, you know, what you're using these models for kind of meets what your objectives are.
Mhm.
Um, so again, I struggle with that one because it's not always easy to find that. So because some of the leading models out there, there aren't always equal trade-offs for them.
Mhm.
But I think if there are people out there who are concerned about this, you can find some of the more privacy respecting ones.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, and I mean, like, I personally, I mean, I use ChatGPT a lot, right?
Mhm.
That's the main one I use, and I pay for a subscription. I think it's like $30 per license per month, and you have to buy at least 2, so I have a couple of licenses, right? And
Right.
part of the big pull and draw for me personally on that was that they say that they don't use anything that you put in as training data and feed it back into the model, and
Right.
but I don't know if that's true or not. I have no idea, and I don't know how you could even verify that or check that.
Exactly. Exactly. And I'd like to make the assumption that that is true.
Mhm.
But I think in cases of, you know, we think back to corporate proprietary things or even proprietary code,
Mhm.
um, are, you know, would a corporate entity be okay making that assumption, right?
Mhm.
If their business is riding on this assumption, are they okay with that? And that's the
Right.
way I like to think about it.
Mhm.
And so again, it's kind of, you take it at face value. You look at the company and you say, do I think that they are sticking to that? Because I know a lot of times we see things with data privacy breaches all
Mhm.
the time, and the way I imagine that too is, you know, if this company had, you know, even if they're keeping it private, they might say, okay, we're not going to use your data to train models, but are they still keeping the logs? And if there was a breach, are those logs out? You know,
Mhm.
that's kind of where my mind goes.
Absolutely. No, 100%. And I mean, you bring up an excellent point of that whether or not this company, in this case, OpenAI, is actually using them
Hmm.
and actually, using that data themselves, they could absolutely get hacked. And then do they keep logs and what does that look like? And how could that affect, public image or yeah, anything really? Like, because I know for me, every time I log in, I have a whole log of all the chats that I've ever had,
Hmm.
right? And I mean, I'm not going back and forth and having a conversation with it. A lot of it is like, "Hey, summarize this," or, reword this, or, but it's
Right.
at the same time, it's all there. And so you'd assume that if I can see it, it's on their server somewhere. And, whether they use it or not, I'm sure that it's could be accessed by somebody coming in from the outside.
Hmm.
Um, how, obviously, how should, thinking about, this from a corporate perspective, how do you think companies and should balance that. Like, because there is absolutely a need to, to your point, to continue to generate more conversational data to make the model better and create and always create more data. But how can companies balance that need for privacy and conversely on the other side, the desire to continue to train their model on all of this data that they're collecting, which I'm sure is, like gold for them.
Right. And as someone who's been working on these types of things for a while, I understand the value of more data is always better.
Hmm.
And so when you have an objective you're trying to solve, try to get as much as you can. So a lot of
Hmm.
it, this I kind of asked, like, well, what do we need this model for? And I think again, looking backwards, for the longest time, when we think about machine learning models, or we think about various types of AI, they've all been very, very focused and very narrow, almost like a scalpel.
Hmm.
They're used for very specific things. Some of the more popular examples I think that people could relate to is an Amazon AI algorithm that just tries to help you to predict what you might want to buy next. You bought
Hmm.
these things. Let's try to make predictions of what you might buy. Or you think about Netflix of rating things thumbs ups or thumbs down, and therefore it will try to then predict um, what other things you might like. And you can
Hmm.
imagine how narrow those models are, right? They can't do anything else. They've only been
Hmm.
trained on this type of data, and they can only give you that type of output. But all of a sudden, we are now have hit these models that can do, because they can now, instead of their outputs being, these ones and zeros of, ones and zeros, yes, you might or might not like this movie, all of a sudden they can give you text. And we,
Hmm.
we as humans are starting to view them differently. Um, and so the parallel that I kind of draw, to me, this kind of feels like electricity. So, when we started to see the rise of electricity being used, it's almost like it's a utility
Hmm.
where, okay, we've got this thing. It has energy. Power. We can power lights. We can power transit systems with it. But it came about. We're saying, okay, we have this thing. How can we use it? And I kind
Hmm.
of see it similar to being with the generative AI wave of, okay, we have this thing. How are we going to use it? And I think we're
Hmm.
still kind of figuring that out. And I think as we get to more specific use cases, which I think we are, and that could be as simple as, hey, I have a chat bot that I like to chat with that helps me rewrite things, or tells me funny jokes. I don't know, maybe it's entertainment in that case. But I think once we start to understand and figure out the ways that it actually is useful, we might have a better answer there. But the one that I do come back to, I think, to hit on one of your questions, is how do we be better about this? Maybe with an era of privacy, is federated learning. And now I realize this might not be the easiest answer, but it's the idea that you could kind of train models in a decentralized way, where you essentially could train on the device that it originates on. And so it's kind of half answer in a way, because yes, the data is still in the model, but going
Hmm.
back to the idea of a data leak, for example. So imagine in a case where you're like, okay, I'm okay if you wanted to train on my data, but
Hmm.
it's still data. Again, it's not the most easy and straightforward answer, but you could say, hey, in some type of way, let's encode the data on my device, maybe
Hmm.
even, again, do kind of a federated training on my device. And then it kind of goes back to the central node, the mothership, if you will. In that case, if there was a data leak, the original logs would not be there, just the trained model. So that kind of might be a half answer there.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating, and I like your example of electricity. And actually, when you started talking about federated learning and decentralization, the thing that and yeah, you just brought up the rise of electricity. I immediately started thinking about the alternating current versus direct current battle, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, alternating current won out, but because of that, everything is centralized. There's massive power plants that are centralized in one location, and then the electricity is broadcast over very, very long distances, right? But if the direct current had won out because the transmission reach is so much shorter for things like that, like there would have had to be a lot more power plants
Right.
around. But conversely, it would have been more resilient from a power grid perspective because, like, you could, theoretically, you could have a terrorist attack or
Hmm.
cyber attack on a massive power plant. and that could affect millions of people or tens of millions of people, where conversely, if it was very decentralized, it would only affect a couple thousand.
No, and I think that kind of makes a lot of sense too. The way you think about federated learning, where it's the way we could go. Again,
Mhm,
we'd have to really think about how all our devices do it. Would I want my phone partially training someone else's model? Maybe, but again, I think it's something that we're still kind of figuring out. Again, going back to where the way that, hey, we can use electricity for a lot of different things. How we're going to use the Gen AI that we're seeing these days, and um, you know in 2 years, maybe we'll see changes. Who knows?
absolutely. And what are some of the when you start thinking about specific AI applications, what are some of
Mhm.
the ones that have shown significant privacy concerns or raised significant privacy concerns, whether it's specific applications or just use cases at large?
Yeah. So the biggest one that I have seen, and I think this one was fairly recent. I believe it was with Adobe Creative Cloud,
Mhm,
where I had seen that people were reporting that I think there was some type of update, and they logged in, and there were some new terms of service. One of those things that you kind of scroll by and be like, yeah, sure. But people started digging into it and saying, okay, what changed? And one of them was basically saying, um, we can use your data. I can't remember what the exact language was, but some people were reading it as they can use our, I think it mentioned models, training models. It didn't directly call out AI
mhm,
agents or anything like that. But a lot of people took it to mean that they can use data in Adobe Cloud to train their models. And so there's a few ways you can think about that. You could say, okay, well, it is on their system, but at the same time, it's a service that I'm paying for. But really, I think the argument that it came down to, where you had people that were creative professionals using Photoshop. I think there were some people that were talking about, right, they work for Hollywood studios and they're working on
mhm,
these projects, and they've got files in these cloud systems. And to see that, okay, you're going to start using this data to train your models on a project that I'm working on. And the kicker was you couldn't access that update unless you clicked OK. Like there
hmm,
was no deny.
mhm,
So it was basically kind of you're locked out of the system unless you accept these terms. Um, and I think that's probably one of the ones that I've seen that's kind of okay. Maybe it wasn't what it might not have been the way people read it. Maybe they were reading it wrong. Who knows?
mhm,
But I think it's one of the ones that we have to start thinking about. You've seen other cases too. We talked about data leaking out of these models.
mhm,
Uh, there's also cases too where some of the image-based models as well that can almost perfectly output the images that were from their training sets. And
mhm,
so again, think back to these corporations that are saying, okay, well, we're just going to use all this data that we have on hand to try to train stuff because yeah, you can imagine from their point of view, yes, we have this unique corpus of data that we can train on that no one else has. Great, we can make a model that no one else has. But again, is it at the expense of paying customers?
mhm,
Um, and that goes down to, I think, the idea of data ownership. And we saw that, I think, one of the first lawsuits that came out were a bunch of artists on, these web social media style sites for artists where they post their collections. You could buy prints, things like that, and you can imagine how those were scraped, put into
mhm,
these models, and you can say, "Hey, make me a picture of whatever that looks like it was made by this artist."
mhm,
Um, so again, we're in this gray area where okay, it's not technically their information, but their data was used to help fuel this. So I
mhm.
really think it comes down to that data ownership.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that we've been having that data ownership conversation for a long time around. I mean, you look at Google and how they make money off of advertising, like, advertising back to us. And I've done it on in social media companies, especially. And I've absolutely in the course of my businesses have used all these different advertising techniques to target people and retarget people and put,
Mm-hmm.
follow them all over the internet. And I mean, I think this is just kind of like the next logical step. It's fascinating though to see it playing out. I mean, one thing you mentioned scraping a bunch of times. Is there a way? Can you know protect like your if you have a website, can you protect that from being scraped? Is there a way to do that?
I mean, kind of. You can, when you think about how things are indexed, you can definitely put in when you're on your site saying, "Hey, I wouldn't want this indexed or scraped," but that's kind of an honor system thing being taken on honesty. That okay, people won't, but they will.
Mhm,
There are going to be people out there that are going to build scrapers and do it anyway. Um, the only other real way that I can think of at the moment is kind of putting it behind some type of login system or paywall.
mhm,
That's still not going to prevent that because someone could say, "All right, I'm going to log in and scrape anyway."
mhm.
So it's kind of just putting those blocks in place.
Okay, okay. So if somebody really wants to scrape your information, it's online. They can get it and they can figure out how to do that. It's just a matter of whether or not you want it online.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the assumption to make.
Mhm. Absolutely. And so how does this, this concept of, privacy by design apply to the development of some of these AI technologies?
Yeah, I think that's a good one, and I don't really know if we have an answer yet because I really don't think privacy by design applies yet.
Okay.
Um, especially for the AI stuff, I still think it's early.
Mhm.
But one of the things I think about in terms of what are things that we can do is I think we've seen it with the App Store, Apple's App Store, um, in terms of having like those privacy ratings on different apps where they basically, and again, it's self-reporting. So
Of
again,
course.
you have to take it at face value. But I think it's a good start in the direction of just saying, all right, um, what what is being done with the data in this
Mhm.
circumstance? And they've kind of, at least within the Apple ecosystem, normalized it so that you can look across them and say, all right, I have a pretty good understanding that my location data is used here. That makes sense because maybe it's a map based application,
Mhm.
um, things like that.
Yeah.
Because I think when you get that big wall of text that's terms and services, it's not standardized in that way where we can easily go, okay, well, what's the part of this I care about, right? Is
Mhm.
there a breaking point for me? And you can think about the Adobe case where there might have been for someone who is a creative artist and says that is a deal breaker for me if they're going to use my content to train models. I can't use or won't use this service anymore. So I
Mhm.
think it really gets down to how can we make it easy, or how can these services make it easy for people to figure out what is that go no go point.
Mhm.
And again, it's probably not in the interest of the companies to do that because they just want you to use their service.
Right.
Um, but again, maybe AI is the answer to that too, where you could say, "Hey, AI system, look at this terms and privacy agreement, and I'm concerned about this one piece. Help me figure out if this is something I want to do because there's so
Mhm.
much text."
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know how many of those you've read, but I can tell you I've never read one in my entire life. I always just kind of click through because
Yeah,
I mean, like, what am I gonna do? Not use email or not use
exactly.
not use any of these applications that I like, I'm not also not personally that detail oriented and never really have been. That's just me. So, but it's fascinating. I think one of the things that I personally really like about specifically about Apple, and their application is that, you may download an app and use it once and give it some permissions, but I'm sure you've seen the little pop-ups where it'll tell
Mhm.
you, hey, do you still want to continue, these are the settings
Yes.
you're using for this app, reminding you of that, right? And that's one of the reasons that I'm personally like I've used Android devices in the past, but one of the reasons I personally continue to use the iPhone now is because they have a much higher bar for getting things into the App Store. And
Hmm.
I feel like they do a better job, and they also do a much better job of protecting a lot of that data, in my opinion.
I agree. And I've seen those pop-ups too, and kind of it's a nice reminder of, hey, I think I've had it with weather apps where it's like, hey, it's used your location in these locations. You still want this to happen.
Mhm,
But part of me, and I like that. Don't get me wrong, but part of me wonders too is if Apple's in a fortunate place to do that, where they really own that ecosystem, and I think they might have the luxury to do that. And again, I think a lot of people in that ecosystem have come to expect that. But I also imagine, I know we kind of have a duopoly between, iOS and Android, but you imagine there was a smaller third-party player that was gaining grounds. Maybe they could get away with the same thing, but would they be able to afford to do that, or would they be in a position where they would need to use that data to make up some type of revenue just to compete?
Mhm. Yeah, it's a fascinating thought. I mean, it's a fascinating thought, and I know, like, I would also assume that in that case, if there was a rising third part, like a third player, Apple and Android would go out of their way to kill them as quickly as possible because, who wants more competition, right? That's
Mhm.
terrible for I mean, when you're one of the top 2, when it's a binary choice and, there is no real competition between the 2, there are the 2 and there's no third. I mean, I mean, I could dovetail into a lot of things that are going on this year, but, like, why would you ever want to allow a third player into the space? And you'd do anything you could, including teaming up with the other person to ensure that you killed it in its infancy, right?
Right.
Um,
Exactly.
and then, I mean, I know we have talked at length about, I know last time we were talking, in person, we were talking about the headsets, like the
Hmm.
Oculus, or I forget, is it Vision Pro that Apple's been using?
It
Um,
is.
and so, understanding that these are some newer technologies out there, how do they, to for folks that don't understand, how do what privacy concerns do they raise? And kind of what above and beyond like things that your phone would track, or your computer or any of these other devices, what is other information that they do track, and what other information do they collect, and what concerns does that raise?
Yeah, I think the headset space is an interesting one, and I kind of, you know, the way that I view it is, I think Steve Jobs said it pretty well. I think it was in his biography. He said, when he started with the computer, he said, okay, this can be a tool for change. And kind of over that course, I think it was throughout the book, you kind of saw this pattern of him saying, how do I decrease the distance from the user to the machine?
Hmm.
Right? He would commonly make that reference of like a computer is like a bike for your mind, right?
Hmm.
With the bike, all of a sudden humans can become much faster. And so you saw that pattern in terms of the computers getting smaller and smaller until, interestingly, in the book, they started development on the iPad before the iPhone.
Hmm.
And then, with the mobile phone stuff heating up, they swapped that, and the iPhone came out first. They used a lot of that technology. So you see that trend all the way down to an Apple Watch of how do I make these types of systems more integrated and seamless with my life, ideally to make things better. And you can think of an Apple Watch in terms of tracking your steps and heart rate and exercise and making sure you're on track. And with my Apple Watch, I love it when I go for a walk and if I forget to set it, it's like, hey, I think you're walking. Do you want to track this? I'm like, oh, okay.
Hmm.
So you see that trend, and interestingly enough, you see that with the headsets as well, where yeah, in theory, that is kind of the next step, where all of a sudden you don't have to look to a screen. The screen is everywhere. And again, I'm saying this with kind of that future view. I think we saw Apple talking about it too, with doing the augmented reality in glasses someday. I think they want to get something like what I'm wearing right now. I think we're
Hmm.
probably a bit a ways off from that. But
Yeah.
looking at what we have now is, I think, kind of trying to peek behind the curtain. So I'm very interested in terms of it from just a technical point of view of, okay,
Hmm.
what's possible. But then again, the same things that you mentioned come up because again, looking at that trend of all right, computer to smaller devices that are better integrating themselves into our lives, hopefully for the better. You start to see how privacy becomes a threat there as well. And so, um, as we start to look at that trend, you have to start saying, okay, how is privacy going to be in these scenarios? And you can start looking at, okay, well, as you mentioned, with cookies and web browsers, they try to follow you, try to, get your location. And sometimes that can be great too, because if there's a local restaurant that wants to advertise to you and They say, hey, I want to target people that are in the area that can actually order and get food delivered. That's great.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, but that's probably one of the better use cases. But there are other people that might not be as, I guess you could say, noble about that.
Mhm.
Um, but then with the headsets, what's interesting is you got the idea of eye tracking. And I think it became really prominent. I think the Meta headsets technically did it first, and the idea was initially just so you didn't have to render what was in the peripheral vision, so it was easier on the GPU. But with the Apple Vision Pro, right, that your where you look is actually your essentially your mouse cursor.
Mhm.
And then you start to think about it in terms of instead of trying to collect information on you, all of a sudden it's as though the company is watching through your eyes. And
Mhm.
so again, you go back to the idea of coding and proprietary information of, all right, I have a headset where, you know, they can figure out where I'm looking at all times. And again, this goes back to the same idea of, do you trust what is being said in the literature? Because I know with the Apple Vision Pro headset, all that data is kept on device. It's not sent back anywhere. It's not used to anything. Um, but again, if we can make the assumption that these devices will become more common in the future, if they do, that's definitely something we got to think
Mhm.
about.
Yeah, and to your point that you made earlier about terms and conditions, all you they need to do is just flash out a new update, make your device unusable if you don't agree to it, and then all of a sudden they can just take all that data because it's stored on your device locally. That doesn't mean that they can't, they can take it the historical data at some point if they just update some of those terms and conditions, and it's fascinating, right? And I think that like the idea of having, because I remember Google was doing the Google glasses years ago, and those never really took off. But I've read some sci-fi books where it's like, you have like contacts that are essentially like contact lenses that are screens, which I
Mm-hmm.
would assume like I don't even know how we would go about creating something like that and having any processing power in it whatsoever, especially when you think about the size of it. But thinking about something like that would be really cool in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. However, conversely, it's like, what are you going to do with all that data and how are you going to, and then I mean, then I just think about the people that are going to be driving wearing them and that would just be a disaster.
Yeah. And again, I look to that trend that I think was kind of laid out in the Steve Jobs biography. Again, of how do you decrease the distance between the technology that's helping you and yourself? And so,
Hmm.
yes, you say, sure, in a scientific way, contacts could be that. Again, I think people would say, okay, you could do like chip implants in your head. And again, yeah, that's all sci-fi in the future. But again, it's on that trend line,
Hmm.
and people are going to inevitably shoot for that, right? You see people trying to shoot for that. I think with Neuralink, that company, right, they're very focused on how do you have that brain computer interface, and there have been progress. I think there was some of the stuff they were showing where you could hook it up and someone could move a mouse pointer on a screen.
Hmm.
So right, I always think of things in terms of that trajectory. So maybe we'll get there. I don't know when, but yeah, yeah. You have all these other things that are always coming along with it.
Hmm. Absolutely. And I've always been fascinated with when you think about like, Neuralink specifically. And I mean, not them specifically as a company, but that technology, right? I've always been fascinated by the thought of, decreasing the amount of time it takes us as humans to learn, right? When you think
Hmm.
about our lives, right? Folks that, we go to, was it preschool, then kindergarten, then we're in school, primary school, and then high school. And I mean, that's, you're 18 then you have you go to college and, if you have a 4-year degree, you're out by 21, 22. If you're going to go something more advanced, right? Like, or like a doctor, right? Where you're in school for 10 plus years after that. And then you're in your early 30s before you're at a doctor, before you're out practicing on your own independently. How could we use something like that to decrease that time, right? And make people and help accelerate that learning curve and not necessarily make people more productive as, or right away, but you think about all of that, when the average life expectancy is 71, 72, and then we're spending, a third of our life essentially in school. right? That may not necessarily be the best use of time as people. So how could, what are the potential societal impacts of decreasing that amount of time and accelerating the learning curve, right? But then it's also like who's approving the data that you're going to download into people's heads.
Right. And I think it all depends too. Is there's so much of this idea of the journey versus the destination is, and again, we could probably always go back and forth when we're talking like sci-fi land, but
Hmm.
the fact that you can put that information in my head and I can recall it, or is it the fact that I learned it and eventually got it?
Right.
So again, right, you could teach me, program into my head that a stove is hot, but again, maybe you put the memory of me burning myself in there, and then I won't do it. But again, it all depends on how that works and if we ever can figure out the exact mechanisms.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a whole other thing, which I'd love to
Yes.
have a more in-depth conversation about at some point because I feel like we could have a really cool one on that. But
Good.
but back to the the like the Vision Pro and the Oculus and
Hmm.
everything. As you think about the point you made about like companies looking through your eyes, what do you think some of the implications are as it relates to as it relates to like targeted advertising and things like that? How could a company, what would the benefits of the company to be to sell that data, and how could they use that data to target ads to you?
Yeah, I really would imagine that it would probably change how ads work, because a lot of times you think about ads trying to grab your attention in terms of what the content is.
Mhm.
So, right, if I'm looking for a new pair of shoes and all of a sudden I see an ad for a similar pair of shoes somewhere else, it's in the forefront of my mind, and it's like, oh, okay, maybe there's some new information I can gather here. But I think the metrics you might talk about would be different. Instead of just saying, "Can I get different types of advertising to the right type of person?" Maybe you start measuring things like length of gaze. Right, that could
Mhm.
become a metric of how long or what was the eyes on ad time. And so
Mhm.
then again, we can make an assumption that if that is the thing, that you want to increase that. So does that mean ads become more eye catching, more distracting, more busy to the fact where you look at it, and then maybe you have dynamic ads. So at the minute you look at it, they start to change.
Mhm.
An image that starts playing when you look at
Mhm.
it. So you have a distracting thing, you see out the corner of your eye, you look at it, it starts to do something. Um, Almost the way that you kind of see social media, that when you scroll through stuff now, it starts to instantly start playing when it's on your screen. And it might be some type of extrapolation of that, of when you look away, it's going to change to something that's going to try to draw your attention back.
Mhm.
You might kind of have this new metric of attention of, and again, knowing that might intermittently be looking away, the ad could say, all right, my first attempt didn't work, I'm going to try a new attempt. So I think there would
Mhm.
be a whole new kind of gaming scenario around that we would see, which I think, again, we're talking in terms of like a hypothetical situation, but one that I don't think could be unrealistic.
Yeah, and I think that it's absolutely realistic, and I know, like, when I put posts
Yeah.
up on, like, LinkedIn or something like that, and you see the number of impressions your post got, right?
Yes.
It's just like the number of times it was on somebody's screen, and I could see, but I don't have any metrics beyond that. Like, I don't know, how many people clicked on a link, how many people looked at stuff, how many people watched things, just have no idea. And so how do I would imagine that companies because they would absolutely 100% monetize this as quickly as possible. How, and they, but it would be just again, yeah, like one of the, like from an advertising perspective, like I go to a lot of concerts, right? And one of the things, like for years, Merriweather Post Pavilion has been sponsored, up here in Columbia, has been sponsored by Mattress Warehouse, right?
Hmm.
And for years, I've been wondering, like, why? Like,
Hmm.
right, like I would never go there to buy a mattress to begin with because I feel like you can get a better one cheaper online, period. Have it brought to,
Right.
all that stuff, right? But like, what's the value there? It's the same thing with billboards. Like, I'll driving down the highway. How do outside of like having something there that people are going to look at, right? How do you track monetization of that, right? And how do you even come up with a business case for it? If you're like an attorney who is one of these, and they're generally ambulance chasers who are out there who like, call me now, like 777-4444, whatever it is. Um, like how do you even begin to calculate the ROI on an at like a billboard like that if it's costing you, $7,000-$10,000 a month, right? Now you're looking at, 80 to $120,000 a year of an investment, and you have no real way to measure measure the effectiveness of that specific advertisement, right? And then you
Hmm.
think about things like online advertising. And what I like about that is that I can absolutely see, like in Google Ads is a great example where if I'm paying to have people in a specific geolocation look at my advertisement, right? I can absolutely see how many clicks, how many times people saw it, how many times people clicked on it, what keywords and what searches they put in for it to come up, and then who clicked on it from there. And if you have your website set up properly, you can understand the conversion rate, right? And if somebody does click, when they click on it, you can cookie them and then set up a whole advertising campaign so that your ads and your banner ads follow them all over the internet, which is why if you like go to a website and then you go to a website to buy whatever, right? All of a sudden you'll see their advertisements on all the other
Hmm.
websites that you go to, right? And so I would imagine that something like this, where you're essentially, it's like time on an advertisement or something like that, or time of engagement. And, if to your point, if it would like, play a little bit out of the corner of your eye, you look at it and then you look away and then it changes and you look back, right? Like you would have all of that additional information
Yep.
and an understanding of the effectiveness of your advertisement in a way that we just don't have right now. And it's fascinating from a use case perspective. Like, as a business owner, I'm really be very curious, like how effective that would be. But like, also, I mean, I couldn't even imagine what that would cost.
That, and then you tie that back to everything we're seeing with AI is,
Hmm.
and you could, we see that, I think, with ad auctions now of things going very quickly. Um, you could take AI and say, all right, based on, again, you assume you have a lot of data, a lot of people. I show some type of ad, someone looks at it, they become disengaged. Based on how long they looked at it, can you predict how that ad would have to shift to
Hmm.
gain attention back? And if people even quickly looked at it a few times, is that enough information to hone it into something that would grab someone's attention long enough for those metrics?
Hmm. And then you start thinking about tying generative AI into that, right? And then
Mm-hmm.
like essentially understanding, because then you'd be able to segment people of like, what type of ad did attract them, and then how do you use underlying generative AI engine to generate things similar to that, and then you're essentially automating the whole thing, right? So now instead of having like one advertisement set, you would be able to understand, all right, you individual one, or in this case you Brian, you are attracted to this kind of advertisement, and then how do we train an AI engine to generate advertisements specifically to the things that draw your interest and draw your attention, right? Um,
Exactly.
and it's fascinating. Like I don't know. I mean, that's a $1 million business idea there for sure.
Yeah, and again, we're still a few steps away from something like potentially happening, but we can see that kind of stuff starting to happen. I think I've seen many ads even today that have started to use generative AI, and I think it's more in the idea of, okay, instead of paying for some type of image service, we could just quickly generate something out. But we might be able to start to see that too, where things become more dynamic.
Hmm. I mean, I would imagine that would be a logical next step, right? When you start
Mhm.
looking, because like I've read a lot about generative AI specifically and how people feel like it's a bubble. Because to the point you made earlier, we're still figuring out how to utilize it as a tool and like effectively. And I mean, and like things like these post generators on LinkedIn or the comment generators
Right.
on LinkedIn, or I'm sure any other social media, as just an example, like they're still very rudimentary, and they're still, they're not like that's not a great use case from a business. That's an expense that is just delivering a convenient, potentially like and not even really generating value, right? But
Mhm.
you can look at things like, decreasing the amount of time it takes you to write, rudimentary code or code to, or write code to, solve common problems, things like that. I think that like now that's a potentially huge, not if it not revenue generator, cost savings for businesses because businesses spend billions and billions of dollars a year on writing new software. Um, and so I think we're still in the infancy of figuring out how to utilize AI truthfully for business. People keep talking about chatbots, but I've never used a chatbot in my life.
Right. And I mean, I think it's interesting too, because there's a lot of talk about it and a lot of people are excited about it. And we're trying to put it in a lot of different places. But there definitely are areas where it is very, very useful. And I think the coding realm is one of the ones. Because I believe, I think I saw that, traffic to Stack Overflow had started dipping when some of these tools came out, because instead of sifting through some forms and people arguing about the exact right way to do something, when a lot of times people are just like trying to look up a basic example of something, um, these AI services can generate that for you. And again, it's not perfect, it's not the exact answer. Yes, they can also make mistakes, but it's again a tool that you use to help you.
Hmm.
And I think when you start viewing things like that, yes, it can absolutely be something that is a cost savings in terms of, imagine if you had an entire team that had this tool and they used it in a responsible way. It's kind of like putting gasoline on the fire. Everything's going to go a little faster. Um, and even for starting research or starting to write things, it can be a good way to plant some seeds. Again, I don't think they are replacements for the
Hmm.
uh, human actions that you're going to take, right? I'd be weary of a code base that was 99% AI written. um, you definitely want that experienced person to go through it, but definitely can be a tool.
100%. And I mean, but it's also only going to take one mistake to unravel all the progress, right? And like I don't know this for sure, but you look at the fiasco that happened a couple of weeks ago with the crowd strike, right?
Yes.
Um, I don't know it for sure, but like the first thing I thought of when all that happened is like somebody in the update used AI to write a piece of the code or used AI in the QA and used AI in the QA process. There was not enough, there wasn't a human in the loop from a workflow perspective. Somebody got lazy and they crashed, all of a sudden planes can't take off, right?
Right. And again, like I look at that two ways. One, yeah, it could have been an AI thing where someone said, "Yep, this looks good," ready to go. Um, but again, you could also say, "All right, it's still a human mistake," and in those cases, we're still getting two mistakes. Maybe there should have been other checks and
Mhm,
balances there. But it shows that even with the tools, right, errors can still happen. And when a human has a pretty good understanding of the scenario, they can say, "All right, I understand logically how this works. I can start thinking about where to find the errors." But there have been times I've played around with some of these code AIs, and I'll say, "All right, here's an error. What do you think's wrong?" And it will just kind of get stuck in these weird loops where it will kind of fix it, but it breaks something else, and then it fixes that error, and it goes back to the original error, and you're kind
mhm,
of bouncing between these two mistakes over and over and over. And I'm like, okay, you kind of tell it. You're like, all right, well, doing this gives me this error, and putting that back gives me this other error. Is there anything we can do? And it just still kind of seems to get stuck in this rut. But again, with as a human, you can kind of, if you have that experience of the system, and again, we can assume maybe these things get better, but who knows?
I mean, we'll see. We'll see. And so, I mean, we've talked a lot today about privacy concerns and the potential problems with, or the potential privacy problems that AI continues to generate. What are some ways, in your opinion, that you can use AI to, to promote privacy and enhance privacy protections instead of diminishing privacy?
I think that's a tough one, and I think it's hard because we see AI as basically these input systems, these input-based systems. So we're always putting some type of information into there. Again, from an Amazon purchase to a Netflix review to a chat bot or a coding bot. right? We're always putting some information in. So I think from the get-go, there is some type of trade-off of saying, all right, I am giving up some type of data that could, uh, you know, limit privacy in some way.
Mhm,
And again, kind of going back to what I originally said, that can be okay if you're okay with that. That's
mhm,
fine, right? It's a form of saying, yeah, if I give up a little bit of this privacy, I can maybe get something back in return, like a better movie review or a better product or an answer. Um, but maybe something that maybe I haven't seen is kind of having a dial on that. So maybe I want to use Netflix, um, or I want to use Amazon or something like that, but I want to turn off the predictive ability. Like, yes, I want to use this service, but like I'd like to dial that down. And I think we're starting to see that with some of the cookie things. Every time you hit a site, it's like, hey, do you
mhm,
mind if we use cookies? And you click once for yes if you want to use cookies. Click 5 times if no. Right? You
mhm.
gotta
Right.
find your way around. So I think it's really tough to think about it. But the one that I think about in terms of maybe AI can help enhance privacy, and maybe it's not kind of directly, but maybe it's types of anomaly detection. So systems that could potentially detect pattern in different types of data usage to potentially prevent privacy breaches and things like that. So almost kind of using these types of systems to help protect the data in the first place.
Mhm. It's fascinating. The thing that I thought of when you mentioned that was, the credit alert services, right? That,
Yeah.
will, hey, say you travel somewhere and your first time, you get, your card gets declined. I mean, I've had it happen where, you pop up in, someplace overseas and then it's like, hey, don't, was this you? Can you verify? Yes. All right, run that transaction again. You're good. Things like that. But I would assume like at scale in organizations like cybersecurity, there'd be a lot of applications in cybersecurity. Uh,
Hmm.
and I mean, I'd assume just all kinds of different areas that we could use something like that.
Yeah.
Uh,
And I imagine it's already being done in a lot of places that we don't
mhm,
even know. There's various types of AIs. There's the AI that's right up front and in your face, and then there's AI that is baked into the system when it's doing its job. You don't even know.
mhm,
Uh, so yeah.
yeah. And then yeah, I know we spoke about this a little bit, but like one of the things that I was brought up on a past episode about a past episode I did was around content and how a lot of people are using these systems, right, to
Hmm.
generate content, whether it be a blog or just writing, I don't know, wherever, just writing all kinds of stuff. And all that goes back on the internet, and then that as the models, as they scrape them and the models pull back down that information using as training data, the model will, I was told, will get, dumber over time and will, some of the errors that are being made from like passive voice versus active voice, or a lot of these writings will get reinforced in models over time. But like how do some of these companies, what are some of the strategies they're using to try to recognize their own content that has been generated? And what would some of the benefits be to an organization that would understand like what content their model created and how to filter that out?
I think it's an interesting problem because uh, I feel like it's similar to when you read like a news report that's like, eat chocolate, eat a little bit of chocolate, it's good for you. And then, a little bit later you'll hear, don't eat too much chocolate, it's not good for you. And you're like, wait, which one is it?
Yeah.
I feel like we've seen similar things with models re-ingesting AI based data. I've seen some that say, okay, right, it really doesn't diminish the performance too much. In some cases, people say it can even help increase it, but then you see other ones where the models will just collapse.
Hmm.
Um, and so those reports are probably based on different scenarios, different use cases. So it's kind of hard to say in which of the scenarios we're seeing and which one is most like what you just outlined in terms of there being a lot of stuff online, and if that's re-ingested. One of the areas that I think is kind of interesting is the idea of model watermarking. Now I know OpenAI, maybe it was a year or 2 years ago, was focused on doing research on this, which is basically the idea of if a model create some type of text, is there a way to kind of have a hidden marker in there so
Mhm.
that if you knew how to look for it, you would know that this was definitely created by that model or not? And when you start thinking about it, you're like, oh, well, that's weird. How would you do it? It's just text. The easy way I like to think about it is if you had two buckets of words, and you just kind of picked a word from each bucket. Now you had a red bucket and a blue bucket, and is an easy way to think about it. And if I was to write something, I would just pick one word from each bucket, and so then you can imagine that my output would be a red word, a blue word, a red word, a blue word, all the way down. Now it might
Mhm.
not be perfect. Maybe I have to pick two reds or two blues to make it work the right way, so it actually reads. But you can imagine even if I edited that, that would probably be enough. There'd be that pattern would be pretty prominent there.
Mhm.
That's kind of how you can think about watermarking coming out in the text-based side. Um, Now, last I checked, the research on that was kind of inconclusive. Of people saying, "Well, it's not really working," um, and so again, we can take that at face value. But also, if there was a way to even get that with a little bit of signal, that's a huge differentiator for someone who has a proprietary model to say, all right, if I can reasonably guess if something came from a certain model, and we collect a new batch of training data, and we have shown that re-ingesting data from the same model would decrease its performance, we can siphon that out. And you can imagine how if a competing company didn't know how to find the right pattern, they didn't know which ones were red and blue, they could ingest that, and that might mess with their model performance. And so there's some speculation here on how this would all work. But again, it's definitely something I think about. And I think about in terms of you have those AI detectors. Was this written with AI? And we've all seen the warnings of, okay, you can't really use those in classroom settings because they can be wrong. They absolutely can be. But the interesting thing that I've seen is if you take writing from a non-native speaker and put it in there, it tends to lean towards its AI written.
Mhm.
So yes, it's looking for certain types of patterns, but again, that's one of those patterns where it might be misfiring. Um, but at the same time, the times that I have used them, it does seem to hone in on some type of pattern that these models are using. And if you sit and look at them long enough, you definitely do see these common patterns. It will lean on different types of phrases, different types of vernaculars, certain types of structures if you don't prompt it to change. So if you said, hey, could you write me a paragraph on this? It's going to use a type of structure that's going to be very, very common. And it's
Mhm.
very likely that these detection algorithms are looking for that type of cadence potentially in the language.
Mhm.
So again, I don't think it's something that we can definitively say, yes, these things work all the time. Um, Maybe they're getting there. But at the same time, if you think about it, these models are just getting better and better and better at sounding like humans.
Mhm.
Um, so it's almost like this cat and mouse game. If someone's trying to detect something that's AI written, the next AI model is going to just be better at sounding more like a more diverse human. So we may never get there, but it's something definitely interesting to think about. That again, going back to the whole privacy thing of, right, I am using this other system, is there a way they could potentially, with some accuracy, be watermarking this,
Mhm.
so that later they would know if they had hoovered it back up?
It's fascinating, man. It's a fascinating debate. It'll be interesting to see how things play out. Yeah, before we close today, Brian, anything else you'd like to say?
No, I mean, this is a fascinating discussion, and I really want to thank you, Nick. I could talk about these things all day. These are, I think, a lot of the interesting areas of technology for me personally, in terms of a lot of the language stuff. So much of our world is text-based information, and I just think these things they're not going to really go anywhere. We may see, some areas where they're not as useful, and other areas where they become more useful. But I definitely think this kind of stuff is going to have a stickiness to it, and just really appreciate the discussion.
I appreciate you, man. I appreciate you taking the time to chat today. As always enjoy our discussions, and I always feel like I learn a lot from them. So thank you again, man. Really appreciate you coming on Robots and Red Tape.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.